I was born in a little coastal town called Brooklyn, New York. Most people don't think of it as a coastal town, but it is. And my father used to like to go fishing occasionally. Two of my uncles owned a boat. And we very occasionally would take the long trip to Jones Beach, which was only about 20 miles away. But in those days, it seemed like a very long trip. So sometime around the time I was a toddler or 3 years old or something like that, I started to meet the ocean. But it was so early that I don't remember the first time. I have memories of being very young and splashing around in the shallows, having a butterfly net and catching little shrimp and hermit crabs and killifish and putting them in a bucket and looking at them, being out on a boat with my father, doing some very easy fishing or fishing from a bridge. There's a bridge that goes across Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn, fishing for little fish from there. And there's a home movie of me at age 3, I believe, catching my first fish on a rod and reel. That was a fish called a porgy. And I was seated on top of the bridge railing with my mother having her arms around me. And she's sort of holding her hand over my hand on the rod and reel. And we're reeling up this little fish that we land on the concrete, and it starts flipping around. And I'm incredibly curious about it and trying to poke it with my finger. And I guess that's the first documented meeting of the ocean in my life.
Welcome to another episode of Meet the Ocean. I'm your host, Paul North, freshly back from some diving in Antarctica, and now that the feeling has returned to my fingertips, I'm back on the microphone. If you didn't already know, Meet the Ocean is a listener-supported podcast and nonprofit. Our mission is to improve how science is communicated to the public by sharing the stories of experts and ocean advocates from around the world. Our educational outreach shares digital content online of rare ocean encounters, and we visit school classrooms in the United States and soon, internationally, as Meet the Ocean will embark on a 3-week educational tour in Australia. Recent podcasts include heroic journeys across Antarctica, sea turtle encounters in Papua New Guinea, new Kids Talk episodes, and even remote islands off the west coast of Mexico. So definitely check those out. But to keeping on, we need your help. Donations big and small help us to continue our educational outreach, and it's all a tax write-off. So check out our website for ways to donate at meettheocean.org. We especially encourage you to join our Patreon community. For as little as $1 a month, you will receive prizes, access to behind-the-scenes content, and become part of our conservation communication effort. Today's episode is pretty special, not only because it was recorded while floating through the Chilean fjords on the National Geographic Explorer, but more so because our guest is a bit of a legend in the conservation community. Carl Safina is an ecologist and award-winning author who has spent his life describing the human relationship with the natural world. And by doing so with character and honesty, he has gained quite a following and some adversaries along the way. Adversaries, you say? Well, yes. Mostly because the truth is hard to hear sometimes. And to suggest that things need to change often breeds great resistance. But if someone is willing to speak up for the natural world, then I definitely want to have them on our podcast. So without further ado, I will let our revered guest continue to introduce himself.
I'm Carl Safina. I'm an ecologist, a writer, an ocean lover, an animal lover, a life lover. That's me.
That's you. And what's your role on board, Carl?
I'm here as the, quote, global perspectives speaker, unquote, which means that my job is to basically give people my opinions about things about the natural world based on Quite a few years, now that I come to think of it, of traveling around, working on conservation, doing research on animals, writing a lot about animals, conservation, ecology, wildlife, and the human relationship with the rest of the living world.
For perspective, can you tell us how many books you have published?
I have published 7 books, and I'm working on an 8th right now.
I'm curious, being a writer myself, a playwright for the theater. What's your process? At least, how long does it take you to write a book, more or less?
More or less, a couple or 3 years. And the shortest was 4 months. That was the Deepwater Horizon blowout. I had not only a very strict deadline for delivering that book, but I also did not want to work on something so miserable for very long. So I really wanted to get it in by the deadline, and I did. And that was 4 months. And my first book took a total of 6 years. I couldn't work on it full time during those years, but it took a long time. And that was good for the book, actually. The book was better.
And what was your first book?
It's called Song for the Blue Ocean. And the basic theme is that fish are wildlife, and what fisheries and fisher people around the world are doing to fish that not only are the wildlife of the ocean, but fish that they rely on for their living and their children's future.
Given your proximity to the water, and I grew up probably about 2.5 hours north of you in the Hudson Valley, so I understand, there's the beach and there are those fishing opportunities, and, life on the water is something that, happens in that beautiful summertime. When did you start to get the notion about the natural world that sort of turned your mind to a question of, this is how it is, but this is not how it was? So when did the notion of conservation, or at least an awareness that something was off, when did that start to come into your life?
Well, here's the way I remember it, is that I always absolutely loved any kind of animal in any kind of circumstance. We had basically no wild animals where I lived in Brooklyn, but it could be, the pigeons in the city, or pigeons I raised when I was a very small child, or anything about the fish, or anything we saw when we went fishing. Or even at the zoo, or even at the Museum of Natural History, where all the animals had been killed and mounted for these fantastic dioramas that were there that showed these habitats that a kid from Brooklyn would never have any ability to imagine if I didn't see them in those murals in the museum behind those mounted animals. So I loved all of that stuff. But the way I remember it is that there was something on television that used the word endangered, and my father explained what the word endangered meant, and I was about 7 years old. I don't know how accurate all of that statement is, but that's my memory of it. And I thought, well, that's bad. And kind of from then on, I thought, I love animals, and if some are endangered, I would like to help them. And that's a thought that to make a long story short, I turned that thought into my life's work.
And you got your degree in?
I got a bachelor's degree in environmental science and a master's and a PhD, both in ecology.
Well, I have to say I'm impressed, not only for your dedication, your profuse amount of publications, but more so that you're willing to, I suppose the phrase is, get in the ring. Meaning, when we talk about overfishing, often, it's a split issue. There are those who are doing the fishing and they're saying, well, we need this for our economy, we need this to feed our families. It's very, it's not a job as much as it is a lifestyle for these people. But then there can be the scientists on the other side who are taking the data, realizing the losses, and those two sides don't often see eye to eye. But you were brave enough to actually go out on the water with these fishermen, collect their stories, and not just once, but several times. So could you describe perhaps some of those experiences?
Yeah, well, the main thing that got me started doing that is that I was looking at the data on bluefin tuna off the east coast of the U.S., a fish that we used to catch a lot and see a lot, and they were common, and they were disappearing, and the data showed that they were disappearing, and yet there were a lot of fishermen in New England saying there's plenty of them here. And the scientists were saying, what the data shows that they're disappearing, and they're saying, well, there's plenty of them here. So I thought, well, I need to just go see what they're talking about. It was sort of a way of ground truthing the data for me. It wasn't intended at first to be part of a book. It was part of a book, but it wasn't intended that way at first. The book came out 8 years later, and that was only part of the book that eventually came out. So a lot went on between those first trips and a lot of other trips to other places and me writing about it and it becoming my first book. But I went out with those guys. A lot of them knew of me by reputation by then because based on the data, I was trying to get their fishery shut down. So I instantly became very notorious, and some of them really hated me. I mean, really viscerally hated me. But they were saying there's a lot of fish there, and I thought, well, if I'm saying that based on the data their fishery should be shut down, I owe it to me and I owe it to them to go see what they're talking about. So that's how that started. And it was interesting because a lot of them are very, very nice people, and in many ways they're people like me because I like the water, I like boats, I like fishing, I like a lot of those things that they like. And I thought about becoming a commercial fisherman. My best friend that I had done a lot of fishing with when we were teenagers, he became a commercial fisherman. We are still best friends. Although at the height of my advocacy for fish conservation, we had quite a strain in that friendship for a little while. And anyway, I mean, I like those guys. I can relate to them. I understand a lot of what drives them. But we often have a serious disagreement in how we interpret what we're seeing. And I think part of the difference is they see local things, and I try to get the big picture, and I go to various places along the coast that many of them don't get to go to see what's happening there as well. And my impression at that time anyway was there were more fish where they were than were left where I was. My fish had disappeared. They had disappeared, and they weren't just moving. The population was kind of shrinking into the densest part of the population that was lasting the longest, and that a lot of the other fish were really very depleted everywhere else. So, I mean, I came to agree that there were a lot more fish there, but they weren't fish that had moved there from someplace else. They were sort of the fish that were still left, that were going there on their migrations year after year. But eventually that fishing became a lot less productive as those fish were also depleted. Just a few years ago, I went to Prince Edward Island in Canada, and there was an unbelievable density of those giant bluefin tuna, these fish that weigh 1,000 pounds or so, unbelievable fish at incredible densities. And the thing was, I was explaining to the fishermen, well, you have a lot of fish here. Yes, you do. But everywhere around you on the coast, they don't anymore. And they thought I was a total idiot for even suggesting that there was a problem, because you could not believe how many fish were there. And within about 3 years, the whole thing collapsed.
Yeah. In terms of that big picture notion, I think that you communicate that as well as anyone I've ever experienced.
Oh, thank you.
That being said, you must know the notion of kill the messenger equally, or perhaps, Plato's cave, where you walk out, see the outside world, and try and tell the people remaining inside the cave that something is not right with the shadows on the wall.
Well, I don't know the latter story, but that's a really good analogy for how it often feels to be me. And as far as kill the messenger, like I said, there not only were there people who really viscerally hated me, but there still are to this day a few people who do, just because I got a reputation as being a horrible person, trying to shut them down. They never actually read anything I wrote or looked at my arguments or why or what the logic was or anything like that, because they weren't interested in doing so. But they just read about me in their commercial fisheries news or this magazine called The National Fisherman, and I was the bad person in the story, so they hated me. So a little bit of that still persists. A lot of those people have turned over, and actually I even know some younger fishermen who think that the work that I was doing 20 years ago was very, very important, because they have benefited from some of the conservation battles that we did win, some of the things that were put in place that resulted in fish populations increasing, which is what the whole thing was always about. It wasn't to say we don't think you should fish anymore. It was to say that if you want to catch fish, there should be a lot of them. Your fishing will get better. But right now you have to catch fewer so there can be a lot in a few years. And the ones who were engaged in depleting them never liked that story, but the ones a few years later who benefit from it, some of them actually, do understand why they're benefiting and why some of those fish are increasing.
Hello everyone, I'm Charlotte Fisher, youth correspondent for Meet the Ocean. Normally, at this point in the podcast, I would deliver a creature feature that would inform on something super cool, like, for example, bluefin tuna can swim up to 40 miles an hour and dive down 1,600 feet. But this time around, I feel it important to point something out. Our host, Paul North, deeply loves the ocean. Pun intended. But when speaking with Carl about the background between fishermen and fisheries scientists, it is important for you to know that Paul was a commercial fisherman himself. For 8 years, in fact. On purse seiners in the Prince William Sound, he spent his summers chasing after pink salmon on the sea mist, then eventually transitioned to sea cucumber diving, which we like to make fun of him for all the time. And just so we are clear, sea cucumbers are not vegetables. They are echinoderms related to sea stars and sea urchins. Suffice it to say, we do not think fishermen are the enemy. Fishermen feed the world, literally. The work they do is hard and often life-threatening, but no one wants their job to be taken away. And no one wants to hear that data trends show that fish populations are declining, even when they are. This is why Carl's work brought out such emotion in local fishing communities. We want to believe that the ocean is an infinite resource, a salty horn of plenty that will never stop delivering in its bounty. But we have seen so many fisheries pay the price for not facing reality. Canada lost its cod. New Zealand's orange roughy fishery collapsed nearly as soon as it began. And from California on up the west coast, people are questioning where the salmon runs of old have gone. Of course, more research needs to be done. More research always needs to be done. But more importantly, we need to believe in what that research tells us. We need to trust in the science and to remove it from the political landscape and take it for what it is: fact. In many ways, commercial fishing is more a lifestyle than a job. Thus, it becomes even more difficult to regulate. But regulate we must. If left unchecked, the ocean will continue to fade into a memory of what it was.
Since writing A Song for the Blue Ocean and all the numbers that you give, I have to think that you still pay attention to the bluefin tuna. And can you give us an idea of how they're doing in this 2018?
Well, the ones off the east coast of the U.S., which is the ones that I have seen and caught and worked to conserve, the rate at which they were plummeting in the 80s and 90s, that seems to have abated, mostly because we were successful enough to get some important restrictions put in place, although far, far, far from what we wanted that would have fixed the problem. But they seem to be bouncing around at a low level, and there are some indications that there's some improvement there, although I don't quite see it. But in the data and in some of the stories that some fishermen have told me, it seems believable that they're doing a little better than they did just a few years ago. But it's nothing like it was in the 80s, where we would just run into them in the ocean, even if that's not what we were out to fish for that day. You would see schools of them. You would occasionally hook one while you were trying to fish for something else. I mean, that hasn't happened to me in years. And the most telling thing where I fish at the east end of Long Island is in the fall, all of the charter boats would switch over to fishing for bluefin tuna, mostly bluefin. There was sometimes some yellowfin if the water was warm enough, mostly bluefin. So they would tell the clients what they're fishing for this month. They wouldn't go where the client asked to go to fish for what the client wanted to fish for. They would say, you want to book a charter with us? Well, we're fishing for bluefin tuna. That's what we're doing. And quite simply, nobody does that anymore. I remember when, if you didn't get your ice the night before and get your bait the night before, there wasn't any ice or bait at 4 a.m. when you wanted to go fishing, because it was this giant rush. You would head offshore with 100 boats. You could see them all spread out across the horizon. And nobody does it anymore. Nobody. So that's a giant difference. To our west, about 50 miles, I hear that people do catch those tuna fairly consistently still. I would think that if there was anything like what there used to be when we were interacting with them, to use a fancy word for catching them, I would think that they would be there and people would fish for them, because people do like, they're thrilling to see and thrilling to catch, and they're great to eat. So if they were there, people would be after them. I wanted to create a group that was the creative end of the conservation group. Some of them do law, some of them do policy, some of them do education, and I wanted to do the work that would engage people's hearts so that we could open their minds to a lot of information that is not really accessible unless you feel at some level that it's important. So you have to feel it first, and we try to make people feel what's happening with the natural world, including the ocean, through things that are creative, like the books that I and a couple of other fellows in the center write, or a couple of them are visual artists. One is a painter. A couple are incredibly good and well-known wildlife photographers, especially ocean-related and ocean conservation-related. A couple work on conserving albatross nesting areas, but write books about that. And the books they're not like academic books or informational books. They're narrative nonfiction. They bring you into these places with the animals and the people that are involved, and they make you feel it. So I don't like depressing or distressing people, but I know that the book is having an effect when people say, I read your book and I was crying halfway through the such and such section, the salmon section or whatever it was. I mean, and if I know what it's like to be really affected by a book. That's why I wanted to write books, because I was very affected by some writers like Rachel Carson and Peter Matheson and Barry Lopez and John McPhee, and some people who, Edward Abbey, made me really feel the places and the controversies that were involved. And I've wanted to work in that tradition. So that's when I know that the book is actually doing what I've intended it to do. But then I'm trying to also do what those books did for me, which is engage people who read. You know, I became engaged in an entire lifetime and a career's work in conservation, partly because I read Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson and the other people that we've mentioned, and they really fired me up.
I, for one, think that storytelling remains the most effective means of getting people's attention for the natural world.
Well, for anything, you know, really, humans are most distinguished by, in my opinion, most distinguished by the fact that we tell stories. And some people have, you know, there's sort of this tongue-in-cheek kind of cottage industry about renaming Homo sapiens. And some people say that it should be Homo mechanicus or something like that, you know. But one suggestion that I saw that really resonated with me was Homo narratans, the storytelling ape. I think that's really what we are. And our ability to not just say, like another ape or a monkey or some birds can say, watch out, there's a snake, but we can say, be careful when you go there. I saw a snake there yesterday. That's a big difference, because we can time travel in our storytelling. We're not just alarm calling or saying, over here there's fish, or over here there's a lot of fruit on this tree, or watch out, I just saw a leopard. That's all in the present tense. You know, we might say, hey, let's go over that way. That's the future, but it's not that far in the future. But, you know, we can say to each other, be careful when you go there, or next year, would you like to do this or that with me? We can do that, and that I think makes us the storytelling ape, Homo narratans.
On that note, I read about 2 years ago about the amygdala in the human brain, and they were purporting that, you know, let's say I pulled a weapon out on you right now, say a knife. You would have a threatened reaction to that and a chemical release because of that. And then they said, if I spoke something to you that contrasted with your worldview, you would almost have the same identical chemical flush within yourself to brace, to hold on, because your worldview is important to how you function in the world. So to have a prophet, quote unquote, come in and say, well, this is different, or we need to do this now so that later things will be better. I think that's why we encounter so much resistance. And because of the effectiveness of storytelling, we're able sort of to maneuver around that, because it's less direct. It's not saying you should or you shouldn't, but rather, here's my story. If you are willing to listen to it or to read it, then you will have some perhaps empathetic reaction, which sort of opens up the lanes of traffic for actual communication.
You don't want to make people feel hopeless. You don't want to turn people off. You do want to try to find the lines of communication that will work and stay connected. And that's always a balancing act in various ways. I think that you need to offer solutions, because if people don't think that there is any way anything can get better, then why should they subject themselves to feeling worried about anything. I mean, if I actually think that something cannot improve, then I would rather not worry about it. But if I think it can improve and I see how it could, then I might even skip the worry and just try to do what would make it better. And that's, I think, really crucial to engaging people. The other thing is that people, everyone, all of us need to be inspired. And inspired to me means you feel the urge to act. If you just say, oh, I don't really care, well, that's not being inspired. If you say, geez, I want things to be different, I'd like to be part of this, then that's being inspired. And among other things, it feels a lot better. And it's also the only hope that there is, because even if the solutions do exist, and really for all the problems I talk about, the solutions exist, they're well known, we know what we could do, but if people don't know that, then they can't really have hope, and if you don't have hope, you can't really be inspired. So all of those things are important, and in any work that we create in talking about any of these issues, I think that, you know, that's a really important part of it. If you can't find and convey that very effectively at a gut level, as well as provide the information to back it up, I think that you need to go back and work on it some more.
Something that I found fascinating that you presented in a recent talk was sort of demystifying the notion that, you know, we have arrived to the modern world and we know all. You know, you gave us a timeline and it was like, well, you know, DNA was only discovered so long ago and not all that.
Not so long ago.
Yeah, not so
really.
long ago, yeah.
I mean, well within the lifetimes of most of the people that are on the ship we're sitting on right now.
Exactly. Whatever opinion we have of ourselves, and we do have, I would think, quite a high opinion, even so much to claim that we have domain over the natural world, which for me is always a hard thought to swallow, because it's that sort of relationship or that sort of ideology that allows the abuse that we've been discussing here.
Well, it lets us, it's a cop-out that lets us excuse the abuse that we want to do. But, you know, almost, there's no wisdom tradition and no religion that says it's okay to destroy the world. In fact, most of them say it's a sin to destroy what you have and deprive the next generation. Keeping things for the next generation is a sacred thing in many religions and many wisdom traditions. In, unfortunately, ours, there is this one translated line in the holy text, the Bible, that uses the word have dominion and be fruitful and multiply, without saying what the end date is on fruitfulness and multiplication. And the word dominion can mean it's your responsibility. It can mean you must take care of. It doesn't mean go out and wreck it. That's not what it says. And it doesn't say go out and don't worry about it at all. That's not what it says. You know, dominion to me, and in many ways to interpret that word, which is it's not the original word anyway, it's somebody's interpretation of a different language. But the word dominion implies that you have a big picture view, you have the power to do things, and with that, you are the custodian, you are the caretaker. It requires your attention. That to me is what dominion means. If it meant to say exploit or something harsher than that, then those are different words and different concepts. Dominion to me is not a very harsh concept, and it implies custodial responsibility. But a lot of people, it's just words, and it's a cop-out for what a lot of people want to do. And a lot of people want to just be selfish and exploit and get what they can get their hands on.
Yeah, a question I often ask people, and I'm every time I get the answer, I'm surprised by it, and I say, are we animals? Are we Homo narratins? Very often the answer is no. And that's not exactly taught in school. It's not in a textbook, but it's sort of a cultural assumption and just an association that we move through this world with, and we're paying for that in my mind.
Well, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is everything else is paying for it. All the other living things are paying for it, and their populations are vastly diminished from what they were a few centuries ago or even a few decades ago. That's the real problem. Everything else is paying for it. But this idea that we're not animals, first of all, we are animals. That's simply a fact. And the idea that we're not is a creation not of most human cultures. Most human cultures considered the natural world to be a deep, deep mystery that they were totally embedded in, that they, in many real senses, were at the mercy of. They believed that when they hunted animals successfully, that the animals whose powers were so obviously so much greater than theirs, those animals must have offered themselves intentionally. Otherwise, how could they have possibly hit them with an arrow if the animal didn't allow it to happen? Or they believed that the salmon in the ocean on the west coast, the Pacific Northwest, they believed the salmon were ancestors and deceased relatives who lived under the sea and returned in the form of fish to feed their descendants, the living people of the land. In factual terms, none of these things is correct, but in practical terms, the sense of reverence and respect and awe, and that if you mistreat it, you can break it or it will be offended and stop coming, that is actually correct, because that's what has happened. As we've mistreated these things, they have stopped coming, and they are no longer there for people to rely on or to take care of people to that extent, or to bathe the world in beauty even. And there's a lot of wisdom in those impressions, and there's a lot of stupidity in the way that we have overthought ways to excuse the worst impulses. But really only one culture has done that overthinking and invented those cop-outs for abuse. Other cultures did not do that. And it's not a basic human trait that we abuse the world around us. That's a new thing.
Taking that one step further, because I asked myself, how can we actually allow these things to happen? And something that you said in a recent talk almost made me jump out of my chair, just because I don't think it's discussed enough. And it's that we almost have a get-out-of-jail-free card, at least conceptually, in that we think that we will colonize somewhere else in this universe. And that, to me, speaks of a removal of accountability, which allows for a lot of the actions that are taking place right now.
I think you're being very, very generous. The idea, some people think that the only hope for the continued survival of humankind is to get off the only planet that actually sustains life, and to go and colonize dead planets or to put hotels up orbiting the Earth. I mean, these are actual ideas by people who consider themselves serious. They're mostly people who've done very well in business. And other people think even past the idea that that's how we're going to survive, because we're going to destroy our own world, or we're going to be the only life form that actually is capable of destroying a planet, and we're going to take that life form and put it on another planet. That's the most reckless, irresponsible, and stupid thing you could possibly plan to do, right? If you really wanted to care about the continuity of life, you would be thinking about how could we take plants and bacteria and somehow make them live on Mars so life could continue when humans destroy Earth. But nobody thinks of it that way because they're divorced from reality. To think that you can ruin a planet that where everything is set up to support life, to create human beings, and go to a dead planet where nothing can survive, and that's where we're going to survive, that's insane. That's a disconnect from logic and reality and any kind of rational thinking. But even worse than that is some people say it's human destiny to go out and live on other planets. And that is just psychotic.
Years of science fiction reading have turned out to bear a bad result.
I mean, you're going to go to a place where there's no atmosphere, there's nothing that can support life, there's no water, the temperatures are all wrong. There's no system at all there that could possibly support life. The bacteria, the fungi, all that other stuff is not there. All the things that you need first before there can even be animals isn't there. And then millions and millions of years after that, you can have things like birds and mammals and primates and people. You're going to go to another planet where there's none of those things, not even an atmosphere or the right temperatures, and you're going to somehow establish survival for people in some way. And who's going to go? People are going to go, and they're going to bring all their human impulses. They're going to be sad, happy, jealous, violent. I mean, wherever you go, there you are. If you can't make it work on the planet that created you, the idea that you're going to go to a dead planet and somehow make it work is nuts.
I often think that one of the reasons that we are limited in how we understand the planet is because we have evolved to think only on the timeline for which we exist on the planet. To imagine something happening 500 years from now seems of no importance to the individual at all. But a man like yourself is raising the flag to say, it's not just the next generation, but it's to avoid, whatever word you want to choose, collapse, extinction, or just a total reversal of millions of years of evolution to this point. Do you think we lack the imagination to actually reverse the direction we're heading in?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I do think we lack that imagination. I think that if you look at other animals, you can easily see the limits of their intelligence. If you look at other people, you can easily see the limits of their intelligence. That clues us to the fact that our intelligence has limits. We are not perfect, all-seeing, all-knowing beings. We're very, very far from that. And we don't seem capable. First of all, there's nothing about the world that's really planned. I mean, the economy isn't planned. People do things willy-nilly, and it just kind of chugs along like a train with a stuck wheel, and things spark and lurch, and stuff happens, and the world is partly in turmoil, and partly there are great things, and Nobody has an overall plan or an idea of where we're headed or what we're trying to do. And that's how we operate. We're not really capable of planning like that. We can plan where we want to go to graduate school. We can say someday we want to be married and have 2 kids. But the idea that we're going to have a plan for how human life will settle into some fantastic coexistence where everybody is pretty peaceful all the time and we don't diminish the ability of the world to continue to generate life, we don't think about those things at all. We just think about what's around us when we see it. We want to grab what we can grab. We want to kill what we don't like. We want to hurt the people we don't like. We want to help the people we do like. It's very reactionary and very responsive. That's pretty much what we're capable of, and that's pretty much the limits of what we're capable of. That's really a big problem. If you imagine, let's say you have a couple of pets, and one is a mouse that can live for 2 or 3 years, and the other is a dog that can live for 12 or 13 years, and you can live for 70 or 80 or 90 years. You look at them and you know that you're going to live through many iterations of what would be their lifetime. You'll be able to see changes in the world that from their span of years they could not possibly see. Well, we live 70 or 80 or 90 years if we're lucky. What if we lived 500 or 1,000 or 5,000 years like some trees do? What if we lived the length of time that these trees live, but we had the sentience and the intelligence of humans, and we saw the causes and effects of things over those timescales? Don't you think that we would act differently and plan differently than we do now? I certainly think so.
I think this is a necessary conversation. I thank you for having it with me.
Well, thank you for having it with me.
Where can people find more about your work?
2 easy places. One is carlsafina.org. That's CarlSafina.org. And the other is my little band of comrades called SafinaCenter.org. It's the Safina Center. You can look that up or just go SafinaCenter.org.
Well, for all of our listeners, I highly encourage you to check out Carl's band of comrades, but also any of his many books. I know I plan on reading them all because you are a storyteller. You are brave and bold and well-researched, but more so, it's not a one-sided issue. Other people are telling other stories, and those stories are often shadowed with the intent of lying to the public so that others can make money. So I think the work that you do is very necessary. I've been looking forward to meeting you for several years. So
Thank you. That's very flattering, and I've really appreciated it. And I appreciate and respect everything you're trying to do. And I'm counting on you. And I'm counting on you. And I'm counting on you. And I'm counting on you.
This episode of Meet the Ocean was produced by Paul North and Andrew Gettings, with sound designed by me, Kelsey Anderson, and original music by Vingast. Special thanks to Carl Safina for the interview and to our youth correspondent Charlotte Fisher for her contributions. You can find more podcasts and educational content, including ways to donate, on our website at meettheocean.org. Remember, we need your help to continue providing these important stories to the world.